Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to join debate and to follow my friend from Edmonton on Bill C-77. It's about military justice and some consequential amendments to other acts, but I want to say about the previous speaker from Edmonton, a huge supporter of our troops, and we will be talking a lot about the Canadian Armed Forces one-on-one in the coming days because of that support within his family for our armed services. And he answered a very simple question at the end in a way that certainly the Liberals would not recognize in the House, that yes, Bill C-77 is very similar to the Harper Bill C-71. Now, they only use the word Harper when they have to hide from their failures. They're trying to project that everything going wrong now with pipelines, with their own record, the abysmal putting a murderer ahead of veterans at Veterans Affairs is somehow Harper's fault. Everything is Harper's fault. There's never accountability on that side of the House, Mr. Speaker, and I hope they go back to their ridings this weekend and reflect on that. They have been here 3 years, pretty much, Mr. Speaker. They should start taking ownership for their failures. This bill is so similar to C-71 that we certainly want to see it go forward. We want to see the impacts. There's really only a few small differences between the bill C-71 and from the Conservative government and 77. I should add, for people that are following this, why did Bill C-71 not pass? It was introduced late in the 4th year of the term, Mr. Speaker, and didn't receive its passage or royal assent. But essentially, the only changes are three. There's some changes with respect to the impact of the Gladue decision in respect to the sentencing related to Indigenous peoples. We will have to see how that application goes with military justice, because certainly all Canadians, regardless of background, choose to join the Canadian Armed Forces and therefore adopt their ethos and code, the Code of Conduct expected, military justice system, and the National Defence Act. I would like to also compliment the Canadian Armed Forces, which in the last 10 years, through the Aboriginal Learning Opportunity Year, the Alloy Year at Royal Military College, and a number of recruiting initiatives, they're trying to make sure that First Nations see themselves more in our Canadian Armed Forces, important institutions like that. I'm very proud that when I spoke in the U.S. Capitol building on the recognition of the 1st Special Service Force, the Devil's Brigade, the 1st Special Operations Unit where Canadians and Americans served alongside each other, the only veteran I mentioned individually by name was Aboriginal veteran Tommy Prince, the Prince of the Regiment, as he was known, for unbelievable bravery and cunning while he was part of the Devil's Brigade, Mr. Speaker. And while I'm on that note, that's how we should approach modern age. Rather than stripping names off buildings like the Langevin block, let's put people up today. Let's highlight people like Tommy Prince. Our most accomplished sniper of the last war was an Aboriginal Canadian from the Muskoka area of Ontario. I know the member from that area has talked about him quite a bit. We should highlight people that were overlooked in history rather than removing or erasing people that are here from our history. But that's a diversion, Mr. Speaker. The other two differences are some changes to absolute discharge provisions between the last bill and this bill, and finally, some terminology changes. Instead of summary trial, there'll be summary hearing, these sorts of things. So that's why, as my friend from Edmonton said, of course we want to see this through. This was one of the bills to really bring the military justice system and the National Defence Act in line with modern criminal code amendments, Mr. Speaker. And that was a huge accomplishment from the Conservative government. Once again, you won't hear them talk about this, but putting victims at the front of our justice system, modernizing a criminal code to make sure that it addressed cyberbullying and changes in technology, Mr. Speaker. We were always trying to do that, to make sure that the victim was not forgotten in the criminal justice system, Mr. Speaker. While I am speaking on national defence, which everyone in this House knows is very personal for me, I think the most formative years of my life were the 12 years I served in the Canadian Armed Forces. I left it having taken more from that experience than I had to give for my country. I left without any serious injury, Mr. Speaker. I left before the Afghanistan war, and I know people that were injured and killed in that conflict, so I feel a sense of responsibility as a Canadian and as a parliamentarian to make sure that our Canadian Armed Forces and our veterans are supported. That's why we're talking justice, we're talking the military. It's an affront to the military, to veterans, to our justice system, that the Prime Minister of Canada stood in this House and defended a convicted murderer receiving treatment. Some people are saying, no, he didn't. Well, through you, Mr. Speaker, talk to your Prime Minister, because he is wrong. The minister is wrong. And if you feel that ministers cannot ensure that their own policies are being followed, you're abdicating your leadership for our country, and you should resign. This is an affront to Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Constable Campbell wore 2 uniforms of service. She was a police officer in Nova Scotia, and she volunteered as a firefighter, Mr. Speaker. Christopher Garnier did not wear a uniform, was an adult, committed a horrendous crime, murder and desecration of the remains, Mr. Speaker. Having been minister, having spent my entire adult life either in uniform or supporting our troops through a variety of charities, some of which I was helpful in starting, there is no program in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, no program that this person would qualify for. Someone pressured the system, someone made a mistake, and this minister is allowing that to continue. At the same time that we're receiving reports from their department that waiting times are back up. So you have a situation, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like that member who is heckling me to reflect on this. Their government is having wait times go up for veterans to access PTSD treatment while they're funding inappropriately and immorally the treatment of someone who killed someone in uniform. I'll tell you, I hope some of the media are watching this. There's none in the gallery, Mr. Speaker. Had that happened under the last government, there would have been 24-hour coverage. The PSAC Public Sector Union would have been in outrage. They would have been having press conferences. This level of disrespect, this level of incompetence appears to be accepted. This from a minister who I have tried to work with. I've said good things about him in the House. But time after time, we're disappointed. They're shelving a report on how well service dogs will help our veterans. They're shelving it. Then when the minister takes meetings with advocates or talks to the media about it, he admits he hasn't even read the report. He's mailing it in, Mr. Speaker. That's not what our veterans deserve. That's not what we expect when a member of this House is given the honor to join the government as either a parliamentary secretary or minister. You read the reports. You understand the file. You're not just a TV host trying to make people feel good. You have to understand what you're doing. And I've seen nothing but failure from that minister. And we're talking about the military. These people we recruit as a country out of high school generally or out of training or college. They serve our country for a number of years or for a career and then retire. As a veteran, our country has an obligation from the first time we speak to them about serving until their end of their life. And what I hear from Veterans Affairs employees in Prince Edward Island who find this Garnier decision horrendous, is a government that won't even acknowledge the profound absurdity of making veterans who are hurt wait behind someone who has PTSD because they killed someone. They've never been in uniform. They're an adult. I know all the programs at Veterans Affairs and outside, Mr. Speaker. This was a mistake, and it's morally reprehensible. The fact that we're going to be here every day talking about this, Mr. Speaker, until they do the right thing. You know, the heckling shows just how disconnected these members, the Liberal MPs, are from Canadians, from veterans, from Canadians who may not have served, but want to make sure they're helping our vets. And there were times when I was minister, Mr. Speaker, I said we fell short. Own it when you have to do better. Tell them you're listening. Don't suggest that privacy concerns means we can't talk about why we're funding treatment for a murderer, Mr. Speaker. That's an absence of leadership. It's an admission that they don't understand the programs and benefits available. And when we're speaking military justice. If someone had been in uniform and had committed that crime, they would not get this treatment. There's about 10 different ways to show how absurd this is. Yet there's an inability to act. The same talking points get pulled out. They mention Harper a couple of times and think they can move on. I've never seen such an incompetent government, Mr. Speaker. In fact, after 3 years, the only true accomplishment of the Liberal government under this Prime Minister is marijuana. I can't actually point, electoral reform, his promises on finances in terms of the budget, in terms of deficits, in terms of taxation, in terms of pretty much anything else he's promised, Mr. Speaker. The only one, and I know it's a personal favorite for him, is marijuana. In fact, the minister he has in charge of marijuana, when he was police chief in Toronto, spoke to the Scarborough Mirror and suggested even decriminalization was wrong, Mr. Speaker. And now, an honourable member, someone I like a great deal, is forced to come out when doctors and physicians are upset, when everyone's upset, and sort of cover that we're going to stumble through the legalization of something that we know causes harm. So, Mr. Speaker, rather than heckling, those members should speak up. Now, we know one that tried to speak up, the honourable member from Oak Ridge's Aurora Thornhill, got tired of being ignored, got tired of being one of the 32 sheep from Atlantic Canada. She got tired, and she took a principled decision to come over to a side where you can talk about these things. You can talk about ways you feel the country has to move forward, issues you think are important. You don't have to wait for Mr. Butts to issue you talking points from the Prime Minister's office, Mr. Speaker. And I think that many of those members should go home this weekend, go into a coffee shop in their riding, and ask someone sitting there about the Garnier case. Ask them if they think it's right that we're making veterans wait while they're inappropriately and immorally serving someone who killed a woman from Nova Scotia who wore the uniform, Mr. Speaker. Get out of the bubble, talk to some real people. Because I'll tell you, if next week they put the talking points away and do the right thing, once the minister reads the briefings on what programs are available in this context, he'll realize there is no program for a non-dependent adult who's committed a horrendous crime, who's never served a day in uniform. A mistake was made or inappropriate pressure was applied, Mr. Speaker. Root that out, correct it. I'll stand in this House and say thank you for finally doing the right thing. Perhaps it's appropriate that the heckles from the Liberals got me into this subject, Mr. Speaker. It is justice-related, it is military-related, but more importantly than that, it's confidence in this government-related. That's what Canadians see waning. They see a government approaching the final year of its mandate that is lurching from crisis to crisis, whether it's NAFTA on the rocks, largely due to their own doing, whether it is Trans Mountain, where because of C-79 we lost Energy East, because the Prime Minister cancelled Northern Gateway, I would say breaching the duty to consult the Aboriginal owners of that line, 1/3 equity ownership with several First Nations bands. I've spoken about several of them in this House before, several chiefs that were not consulted. The Prime Minister violated his duty to consult First Nations, just like he did when he violated his duty to consult the Inuit, when in Washington he made changes with respect to land and water in those areas without speaking to First Nation leaders and by giving a courtesy call to the Premier half an hour before the announcement, Mr. Speaker. Crisis to crisis. And on veterans, Mr. Speaker, the crisis really began in Belleville, Ontario, when the Parliamentary Secretary on U.S. Relations, the Minister of Defence, the member from Kelowna Lake Country were standing behind the Prime Minister, wearing their medals, flown in from all over the country. I was Veterans Minister at the time. I was trying to fix things. I was being honest that we had work to do, but making progress. Flew them in, Mr. Speaker, and he made two key promises to our veterans, the people that serve and are governed by the National Defence Act, and then retire, some with injury, some without. He said to them two things at that event. There was going to be a return to lifetime pensions. That was a return to the Pension Act. Why do I know that, Mr. Speaker? Because when I was on the edge of settling the Equitas lawsuit with veterans, the settlement had to be turned into an abeyance agreement. Why? Because they were told the Liberals were going to return to the pension. Now, I developed friendships with those veterans by that time, Mark Campbell, Aaron Bedard, many others. They remain friends, they always will. And they felt bad when they called me and said, we won't be able to settle, but we want to work with you. We'll put the lawsuit on hold. In that promise they made to Equitas veterans was their promise to return to the Pension Act. The Pension for Life announcement made a couple of days before Christmas last year, Mr. Speaker, that should be a sign that they're hiding bad news, announcing it literally on Christmas Eve. That was essentially a slightly tweaked version of what I had already announced. There was no return to the Pension Act, Mr. Speaker. The new Veterans Charter is still in place. The other promise was to never see veterans in court fighting their government. And what upsets me about that, Mr. Speaker, is the promise they made to the Equitas veterans that they were going to return to the Pension Act led to an abeyance agreement. But that abeyance agreement expired when the Liberals were in power. What did they do? They didn't renew that abeyance agreement. They let it lapse. So the court case was back on, and they made the veterans go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, Mr. Speaker. Once again, justice, the military, veterans, all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, Mr. Speaker. Again, breaking their central promises. So, I like the minister. I know he served honorably. I know people from his regiment. I know people that went to staff college with him. He's likable. He's got to start stepping up. I'm calling that group of veterans behind him in those photos the Broken Promises Battalion, because they were called out from across the country for a media event when the Prime Minister had no intention, if he'd wanted to follow through, or he didn't know the costing and ramifications of his promise. Either one of those options, saying something you have no intention to follow through on, or not understanding the file enough to know the costs or the ramifications about implementing a return to the Pension Act. Remember, the Pension Act was changed by a Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. The fact the Prime Minister did that, and the fact that honourable Canadians running for office, none of them were actually members of Parliament at the time, but they were all veterans. I respect their service. All of them flanked him behind, Mr. Speaker. Medals on, while the Prime Minister said those two things: return to lifetime pensions, and veterans will never have to face their government in court. Within 2 years, Mr. Speaker, both those things were broken. We now see the Minister not reading reports before meeting with veterans who are juggling a lot of issues, sometimes injuries, serious ones, Mr. Speaker. Now we see the waning confidence in this minister fade even more when, as wait times increase, miraculously to the front of the line for PTSD treatment comes someone who's in a correctional institution for murdering someone who wore not just one, but 2 uniforms for her community and her province, Mr. Speaker. I want all of those Liberal members to go back to their ridings Speak to veterans, go to the Legion and ask them what they think, and I want them to come back next week and do the right thing.